Welcome to the Wisdom of Show. I'm your host, Simon Bowen, and every week I'm speaking to the world's greatest leaders, thinkers, and entrepreneurs about complex issues and impactful leadership. Join us in the Renaissance of Wisdom. Well, I'm very excited because my guest today is someone that many of us in Australia have spent 30 years watching on TV. My guest hasn't just spent 30 years reporting on events around the world across multiple networks here in Australia, but has spent decades actively trying to change the world as well. Tracey Spicer AM is a multiple Walkley Award winner, journalist, broadcaster, the ABC, Network 10, Sky News, but she's far more than a media veteran. And our reason for having her on the Wisdom of today is because of the deeper thinking that she puts into the world around her and in the movements that she's trying to create. She's the inaugural national convener of the Women in Media. She's a Sydney Peace Prize recipient alongside Tarana Burke for the work she did with MeToo in Australia. And she's been awarded the Order of Australia for 3 decades in media. Tracey, I want to talk about the TEDx talk that had 7 million views, The Lady Stripped Bare. We have to talk about that. I want to talk about your latest book, Man-Made, and asking one of the most urgent questions of our time about how is bias of the past being built into systems of the future. And I'm just so excited to be having this conversation with you. Thank you for giving us this time. And I'm just really looking forward to what we're going to be able to share just through the course of the episode for people to think about, become more conscious of. So, you must feel uncomfortable when someone's sitting there talking about all this sort of stuff about you and everything else. But the history, that the pedigree of the history is actually where the wisdom is collected. And, when you hear that back and you think about your career, what starts running through you? I mean, you have humility about you. So, I know that it might be uncomfortable. When you hear back through decades of career like that, what starts popping up for you in your head as you hear that career being read about and talked about?
Well, Simon, thank you for that lovely introduction. It's wonderful to be talking to you today. I think it's the most important time in history to be talking about wisdom and listening to the wisdom of leaders. But when I hear that introduction, I immediately go back into when I was a child, and I was a bogan growing up in the outskirts of Brisbane. And I never thought that I'd be able to be a journalist, let alone a television journalist, let alone someone who worked in advocacy around the world with women and girls. I guess I'm still astonished that those things have happened in my career. And look, I'm enormously grateful that I've been able to have a lot of, learnings on the way that I'm able to share with people, because storytelling is how we move forward.
Sure. Do you want to just give an explanation for our international audience what a bogan is?
I probably should, shouldn't I?
You should, yeah.
Is an Australian expression, someone who is quite rough and ready, grew up in a lower socioeconomic kind of area. In Australia, it's characterised back in the 1980s with wearing a flannelette shirt and maybe Ugg boots, those woolen kind of boots outside of the house, and driving, fast, loud cars. So the area that I grew up in, not a lot of people went on to have careers in business or in television or in, I suppose those kind of thinking careers. It just seemed to be outside of the boundaries of what was expected of us. And I guess in the era when I grew up, I'm almost 60 now, it was expected that girls would become either a nurse or a teacher. There seemed to be very few options outside of that.
And, I have to add to that, bogan in Australia is actually far from a derogatory term. It is a humorous one, but often seen as kind of the salt of the earth and, the workers of the country. It's had different connotations over the years, but, I think in a lot of ways, a lot of people identify themselves at some level into there, but certainly the story of where you've come from just prompts me to ask a question without notice, which is really, I remember seeing Hugh Jackman talk about his career, and someone said, how have you built this career? And he said, just always be ready. and so always be in shape, always be ready, always, be prepped. And he woke up to the phone at 2 a.m. in the morning, and Steven Spielberg was on the phone and said, we want you to host the Oscars. And he went, yeah, I'll have a go. And his whole career has been just always be ready. And when you get asked, say, I'll have a go. I'm interested in that journey from that girl to this 30-year career. I doubt you planned it. I doubt you kind of in school went, you know what I'm going to be? I'm going to be a journalist. I'm going to have 30 years and be a genuine change maker, impact maker in the world. How did career map out for you? Was it always being ready? Was it a series of happenstances? Was it about connections and relationships? For someone young in the early stage of a career, what allowed you to create this?
My sister and I were really fortunate. And I say that I'm proudly a Bogan from the outskirts of Brisbane because, to your point, it gives you so many gifts having that kind of upbringing. And one of those gifts was a real passion for social justice and workers' rights. That's built into every fibre of my being, I guess, because of the environment I grew up in. But my sister and I were also fortunate to have a very strong mother and a very sensitive father. And so in a way, back in the day, they each broke down those stereotypes. If my sister or I fell over in the backyard and grazed our knee, we'd run to Dad for a Band-Aid, not Mum. Mum would have gone, well, get up and get on with it. Come on, be a strong woman, be a tough woman. Whereas Dad was always the one who'd give us the hugs and be sensitive and gentle and kind, right? So I guess we had stereotypes from a gender perspective broken down at a very young age. Mum and Dad both worked full time. Mum said to us, girls, the world is your oyster. You can do anything, go out and grab it, and don't take no for an answer. And I think that's a gift as a very young person, because then it allows you to dream big. You don't see the boundaries around you. You think, Mum always used to say to me, well, give it a try. What's the worst thing that's going to happen? And I think that is really something to live by, and it's something I've lived my entire life by.
Yeah, that fear that people sometimes have about stepping into and doing something, what's the worst that could happen is a throwaway line, but there's some real truth in that, isn't there? When you actually step back from something you're thinking of doing that you're fearful about, but when you really actually step back and go, honestly, what's the worst that could happen? It's often not as bad as people think. But sometimes the cause is big enough that the worst is worth gambling on as well. You grew up with social justice as a life theme, and fairness, and Australia's built on fairness. And even if the worst that could happen is pretty bad, sometimes some causes are big enough that they justify the risk. And I'm not sure if we have the same risk propensity for people to have a go in the world today. So you don't just accidentally get 7 million views of your TED talk. That's kind of that's starting to get into the same levels as Brené Brown and others. So the lady stripped bare. I think there's two things, right? The experience of that, and what do you think drove that? The distribution of that video. And then I'd love you to speak into the lady stripped bare and what the TED Talk was about.
Oh, it was one of the favourite things I did in my career, actually, to be honest with you. After growing up in Redcliffe, getting a university degree, working in radio and television for decades, I thoroughly enjoyed it. But one thing I didn't like was the fact that I effectively had to put on a mask to appear on television, pretty much 3 inches of makeup, my hair done to within an inch of its life. I had one floor manager who, if one hair was sticking out, he'd run screaming out of the studio to the hair and makeup department, rogue hair, like it was the worst thing that had ever happened in the history of the world. So I think after doing it for decades, I wanted to literally deconstruct the extra pressure, time, money, cost that appearance has on people, particularly women in the public eye, but also women in a corporate workplace. The expectation of how you have to appear in business. compared with men. And certainly with men, you have to have a lovely suit and your shine shoes and whatnot. But for women, there's extra time and money because of the hair and makeup expectation to look workplace ready effectively.
Yeah.
And I thought, what's the best way to get this across in an 18-minute TED Talk? I know they're 4 minutes these days, but I had to memorize 18 minutes. I'd never done that before. It was quite terrifying. So I thought I would physically deconstruct it. I got up on stage with my heels, all of my hair and makeup on. And while I talked about the pressure on women to appear like this and what it does to us and what we could achieve if we didn't have to do all of this, I gradually took it all off. Not all. I want to assure anyone watching or listening, I didn't take it all off. I sprayed my carefully blow-dried hair, and honestly, women were screaming in the audience. They said, not the hair, anything but the hair. I wiped off my makeup. I took off my corporate dress. I just had a pair of casual shorts and a singlet on underneath, kicked off my high heels. And it was one of the most liberating things I've ever done.
Wow.
I was really surprised by how it took off around the world. I got a lot of trolling about it. I'm not going to lie. I got a lot of criticism, particularly from men's rights groups, calling me an egg sandwich that had gone off in the sun, all this ridiculous kind of criticism of your appearance that you get as a woman in the public eye. But overwhelmingly, I got a lot of positive messages from women saying, finally, I feel like I have the freedom now to go out without makeup on, to go out without blow drying my hair. And that just made me so happy.
Yeah. It's interesting when you talk about, you got a lot of criticism for it as well, because we're pretty quick certainly in the days of social media, to criticize from behind a screen and without actually making any contribution, and I guess, that social justice early start for you, a strong mother and a sister, there's clearly a through line around women and bias and what's expected from them. My youngest daughter and I were having a really interesting conversation yesterday about women in sport. The highest rated broadcast in Australia was our Australian women's football team, the Matildas, like by big numbers, right? Should they be paid the same as the Australian men's soccer team, right? If you judge it on television, right, you kind of got to go, well, so every time there's a premise being raised about equity or social justice or just fairness, it always seems to garner, and whether it's about women or child labor or whatever it might be, I'm just trying to think of things, somehow, even though it might be just patently fair that the person's talking about, there's always a very strong opposition to it that bubbles out. And this might be a tough question for you to answer, but I often think about, what can I say that created enough pause in the moment for us to have the conversation? Because pause is the key. Like, how do we interrupt your habitual response? And so when you're talking about this through line of, bias about women and equity and the difference of expectations and things, if you were going to start every dialogue with something that just caused the receiver to just take a beat and just listen for a beat, what might you say? I know that's might be quite a hard question to answer, but imagine I'm pushing back, going, "Oh, come on, Tracey, men in the media really get the serious stories, and you're there to do the weather." I don't know if anybody says that, but I'm trying to play the role. How do you just create the pause? You don't have to convert my thinking, but just create the space for me to maybe listen.
It's such a good question, and I learned so much about this as a journalist through communication theory, but also during the MeToo movement, because when you are a journalist, you've got 2 ears and 1 mouth. It's more important to listen than it is to speak. Right. And whatever way you craft your story, you think first about the audience. Who's in the audience? What are they thinking about today? How do I speak to them in their language? So I took a lot of that audience theory into my speeches around the Me Too movement, because I started out speaking to rooms of women, and after a couple of years, I spoke to a lot of rooms of men. And I thought, how am I going to talk about this in a way that is really meaningful when overwhelmingly the number of victim survivors are women and girls? And so certainly I started talking about, you know, their sisters and their mother and
Right.
their auntie, whether they would want any kind of offence like this to happen to them, so they could think, gosh, this could affect my family. It's not just about what could affect me. But an even more powerful message I came upon after research was that in workplaces where there's a high level of sexual harassment and assault of women and girls, there's also a high level of bullying of men. So when you talk about a lot of these
Interesting.
social justice issues, you can kind of flip it regardless of the gender. For example, and I know we'll talk about this more later, but it's probably a little bit of a tease to it. When we talk about AI bias, it's often
Yeah.
about women being excluded in the job application process. But in actual fact, if young men apply for, say, insurance, they get their first car and they apply for insurance around that, they're actually penalised. They're charged more and they're considered to be worse drivers because historically young men have had more accidents. So what I'm saying is there's bias built into every aspect of life. And if you're trying to open a conversation to bring people together, you can't just talk about examples at one polarized side of the debate. You have to talk about it on both sides so there's some kind of shared language around it.
So you have to, it's just interesting what you're saying about, there are many examples of men, being subject to these same circumstances, and maybe we're more universal than we think.
Yes.
And, we need the people that really are driving change to have the capacity for simultaneous multi-perspective,
Yes. Well put.
and just to be able to see it from every angle, and then, figure out a way of helping people, get into that space. And you spoke about, as a journalist, you had to learn to really listen. And how do I, you speak like, you almost speak like a marketer, like what's in it for them? How do I
It's all
figure out?
sales psychology, isn't it?
Yeah, it is a little bit. And so in that 30 years of journalism, ABC, Network 10, Sky News, you're inside the media establishment, and at the same time you're challenging the media establishment. That kind of must have created some interesting moments. And yeah, I'm interested in what you would, in the world that we live in today, we live in a world of fake news. And when the news came on TV when I was a young adult, that actually was the news. And there seemed to be balance in reporting. You watch different stations to get a different perspective these days. And what would you change about the media if you could just click your fingers, wave a magic wand, and you could instantly change it about the media? What would you, because it's so powerful and pervasive, what would you change about the media from an insider's view and understanding what it really is as a machine?
In a perfect world, we would simply hear the facts and they would be unbiased. But to your point, there has always been bias in the media, whether it's mainstream or what we used to call new media. Traditionally, with the mainstream media, there is an element of bias depending on who the proprietor is and what kind of funding they put to what programs, what kind of stories they support being higher up in the bulletin or on the front page. There's a lot of nuance in that. But with new media, we're seeing a lot more misinformation and disinformation. And in actual fact, we're seeing bias writ large. We know what the right-wing social media outlets are and the left-wing ones, and people are going down, I suppose, silos of their own bias, which is a huge problem and a threat to democracy. One thing that I would change if I had the power, gosh, it would be incredible, is actually to put more diverse voices within both mainstream and social media in each of the platforms and outlets. Because when you have more voices at the table, you come up with a more collaborative, collective outlook that represents everyone in the population. For example, when I started out in the media, it was very male dominated. We would inevitably, because of the makeup of the newsroom, lead with stories that were more of interest to a male audience. The more women that came in, there was a mix of stories, and that kind of broadened the appeal really to the population. So, I mean, certainly more diversity at the top in leadership, but also in newsrooms. And then you have, it's like diversity of thinking in the business sector. Then you have all the best brains at the table.
Yeah, it's interesting. What is the price we're paying for bias? You know, we're paying a collective price. You know, a company pays a price for having bias. It just does. We're paying an individual price. I don't even know how you would quantify it, but what's the price we're paying as a society for, you know, bias that is still hardwired in many respects? You know, it still has to be unlocked. You know, we're paying a price. In your experience, spending a lot of time speaking in this space, what are some of the prices? What's some of the currencies that we're paying for bias in?
We're paying a price on so many different levels, but the biggest one is the widening of the gap between rich and poor, the concentration of power and money in fewer and fewer hands, particularly with the tech oligarchs in Silicon Valley and places like Texas, predominantly in the United States. But when I look at it from the global north versus the global south perspective, there are people in Kenya paid $2 an hour to look at the most horrific images online to label them for machine learning. That's at one end of the spectrum. And all the capital for that terrible, terrible work that ruins people's lives is going to the global north. So that's why we're seeing a widening of the gap between rich and poor with that bias. But also, I would say from a business perspective, you're not getting the best brains at the table, because if you have if you put out a job application and your algorithm is sidelining women or people over 50, regardless of gender, or anyone living with a disability, you're not getting the best people at the table. You're not getting that diversity of thought, and therefore your products aren't going to do as well. So there's a business cost, and it's proven by research, but there's also that huge social cost as well. And I guess the third thing is we talk about a lot of different intersectional biases, but I want to talk about that machine bias as well, which is, as humans, we tend to think the machines are right. We think they're unbiased. We think they're perfect. We think whatever the large language models say to us is correct. And if we keep doing that, we're going to see large-scale job losses. Human jobs are going to be taken over by robots. And we've allowed that to happen because we think that they're smarter and better than we are as humans.
Yeah, and yet we know that the LLMs hallucinate.
Yes.
We know that they, you know, sometimes just make stuff up. They're so power hungry. You know, if they can get to an outcome rapidly, they'll do it. And if you don't check it, you know, things will slip through. And, you know, they are biased because they're built by people, and then it gets hardwired in. It brings us to, I want to come back to AI in a minute because it's the conversation of the decade. But before we do that, I think we should explore Man-Made, which is, you know, a book that you've published. And it's really about how our biases of the past, you know, affecting and shaping into the future. I'd love to unpack some of the thinking out of Man-Made, and then we'll segue from that into not just the man-made world that we're in, but, you know, what might become the AI-made world that we're in. So just step us through the thinking behind the book, what you really, the message you really wanted people to get from you having written that book.
Well, it started with something very quirky. Probably about 9 years ago, my 11-year-old son, who's now studying computer science, funnily enough, said to me, "Mum, I want a robot slave." And I said, "Darling, what are you talking about?" Anyway, in a moment of appalling parenting, we'd allowed our young children to watch South Park so we could get an extra half hour sleep in the morning. And in this episode, Cartman, a very naughty boy, was ordering around his Amazon Alexa like he was some kind of colonial master. And I had this epiphany that this idea about women and girls being servile in the home was being built into the female voice chatbots that were proliferating around the globe. Because at that time, if you listen to the chatbots in the business sector, they all had male voices because of the perceived credibility and gravitas. Thus began a deep dive, and I very quickly stumbled upon even worse stories about deepening stereotypes, but also this becoming a matter of life or death. For example, did you know that self-driving cars at the front of them operate on AI light sensor technology, which means that they're coming up to pedestrian crossings in testing and not recognising people of colour as human, because the light sensor technology works best on people with white skin. So that's one of the issues that is coming up. There are a lot of issues in the medical sector. For example, Simon, if you or I go to a hospital at a time of, say, a pandemic and there are scarce resources, there's one ventilator, and we're sitting next to someone who's 30, the algorithm will always give the ventilator to the younger person instead of us, because they're perceived as being more productive in society and in the workplace. So what I found very quickly was it wasn't just the gender factor. There were multifaceted biases built into the technology we use every day.
And not even things that you might think about. I had not even thought about why a female voice might be used for certain things in technology and a male voice might be used for other things. I hadn't even pieced that together in terms of the perceived role of the voice. You know, is this an authoritative, strategic thinking, guiding voice? We better make it a male voice. Is this I'm just going to do the job and get the tasks done for you? We'll make that a fee. I hadn't even pieced that together. You know, how do systems that have bias protect themselves to keep the bias in? Are we saying that some of this might be consciously designed in, or there is actually deliberate systemic protection of some of these biases, which feels even more icky?
Well, it comes down to that sales and marketing conversation. If, from a sales perspective, the product appeals to our deep-seated biases and stereotypes, those that we had years ago to identify the saber-toothed tiger on the savannah and realise that was dangerous, so we better run or get up a tree, those products that appeal to those historic stereotypes do motivate us. And so it's a deliberate design choice. Wow. But on top of that, and it took me a long time to get my head around explaining this in layperson's terms, the bias does start with the data sets, the words, the images, which are inevitably historical, and they tend to lean more towards men, white populations, people who live in a city rather than people who live in rural and regional areas, younger rather than older, people without disability rather than people with disability. Then the algorithms, a lot of people think an algorithm is a mathematical equation. It is, but it's also an opinion written in code about how the world should work. And when those algorithms are written by a very small group, a homogenized group in Silicon Valley, their own unconscious bias goes into it. Now, that's not their fault. We all have unconscious bias, but that's how the bias is deepened. And then it's deepened further by machine learning and, of course, agentic AI, which is autonomous. So there are design decisions, there's the data sets, there's the algorithm. The bias comes from all different angles.
Yeah. Well, you know, we might build a model for this in a minute. I'll just close the loop. We'll have some fun and build a model. You know, I'm thinking we could build a model around technology and maybe AI and explore the whole bias conversation a bit deeper. But I just want to put a bow on the man-made piece. You know, man-made won the social responsibility category in the Australian Business Book Awards, and corporate Australia, you know, recognises that it needs to do some things. And I think around the world, you know, companies know that it's actually just good business to be seen to you know, have equity and things like that. But there's a difference between effective and performative. And you've probably had a lot of conversations with people. So Yeah, what do you see that is effective when people are really trying to tackle sometimes deep-seated bias in a system versus performative? Let's kind of be seen to be tackling deep-seated bias, but we're not really changing the system. What are some of the things you've seen in that context?
Yes, the proof of the pudding is in the eating, as they say. A lot of people, when my book first came out 3 years ago, were talking the talk but not walking the walk, as we say. But in the last 6 months, believe it or not, I never thought I'd see this, AI ethics has become really hot globally.
Yeah, right.
Because regulations have started coming in. If you deal with Europe, you have to deal with European Union's AI Act. There's different national legislation in different jurisdictions around the world. Certainly, America is still very free market. China is very much from that communist model. They're quite prescriptive and they've cracked down on a lot of things. I think some of the best governance models are actually in Singapore. From Australia, a very near neighbour to the north. But when I see companies doing it well, what I see is, initially AI was seen as an add-on, sort of a bolt-on, but companies now are thinking about it strategically. First of all, where do we need AI? Not necessarily where do we want AI? Where does it work from our overall company strategy? That's a smart way to approach it. And then the conversation's got to start from that ethical governance perspective. And then you build a system from the ground up, because a lot of the research is showing the productivity increases that businesses are having with AI. The most successful businesses bring the workforce along with them. They ask people at the computer, on the ground, okay, what's working for you? What's not working for you? What kind of ethical conundrums are you having? You teach us as much as we teach you. So a kind of worker-led AI transformation from a responsible AI perspective is the best way to do it. And when you think about the nitty-gritty of that, that's things like, if you're developing an innovation, use inclusive design. Get everyone at the table who's going to use the widget to design it and test it. And then you've got all the brains at the table. Then there's bias testing of the data sets and algorithms. That's mandated in places like New York if you use hiring algorithms, and there are penalties. And then the third big thing is human in the loop systems. Every step of the way, have human oversight before something is sent out to your client, to your customer. So to answer your question, the companies that are doing it well, and not just saying that they're doing it, have gone through it and thought about it from a strategic perspective. And it's become a lot more easier in the last 6 months because there are so many AI governance courses around that are quite simple in lay person's terms. I guess there's more information now, which makes it easier.
Yeah, it's interesting. Let's try and create a model for maybe not AI bias, but AI integrity.
Oh, I love this.
Rather than talk about the negative, the negatives are part of the integrity picture, right? This is not about just bias in AI. It's how do we build integrity into AI? And you've said a few things which, naturally gives rise to a triangle. And the premise of a triangle, of course, is if you lose one side, the whole thing collapses. And you've spoken about data sets several times. You've spoken about the algorithm several times. You've spoken about machine learning several times. And I'm wondering, this is all being made up on the spot, but I'm wondering if they represent, a reasonable way to look at AI integrity, and if we build it out from there. Is that making some sense to you so far, given the exposure and the thinking you've done about this?
I think that's terrific. And I love the word integrity. Globally, we're grappling with different words around this. Ethical AI, responsible AI. They're even calling it sober AI, which I think is hilarious, because when some of the bots go wild, it's like they've had a little bit too much to drink. But I love that AI integrity model.
So if we look at this as a binary model, what you and I have been talking about all the way through is bias, not just in AI, but systemic bias.
Yes.
Basically, that is hardwired in. What is the opposite of bias? If we got rid of bias, what would the opposite binary word be that we would put in there? And so, if we said, do each of these three sides, depending on how they're done, do each of these three sides drive towards bias or equity, depending on how they're executed, would you say?
Oh, 100%, yes.
Right. So if let's start with data sets. If we wanted to make the shift from bias to equity, and I limited you, I said, just give me the top three things that we'd have to get people to focus on in data sets to see a shift from bias to equity, just in the data sets. What, off the top of your head, what would the top three things be?
Well, there's an expression in computing, garbage in, garbage out.
Mm-hmm.
So the first thing would have to be clean the data sets. Don't use dirty data sets. So clean data sets is the first one. The second one is a movement that's actually called, believe it or not, intentional bias, which means taking a data set and even using agentic AI to work out where the demographic gaps are and filling them. For example, putting more people over 50, putting people with disability in, kind of thing. And then the third thing I would say is actually make them smaller. Large data sets inevitably are quite unwieldy and can contain a lot of garbage. Whereas we're seeing the growth now of smaller, more curated data sets, easier to control, easier to make sure that the bias doesn't exist there in the first place. So, yes, clean it up, intentional bias, curated size. Well put.
Great. And if we really pursued those things, is there a shot that we'd be able to move from data set bias to data set equity?
Yes, and that's happening a lot around the world. I mean, I know we have three here, but overarching all of that is a movement towards actually synthetic data rather than naturally occurring data from the past, because synthetic data can get rid of that historical bias in the data problem. So there are a lot of solutions now that can bring us to data equity, absolutely.
So you're saying synthetic data is a positive movement?
Yes, because
Great.
with synthetic data, you can create that equity from the get-go in the data set.
Perfect. What would the three big ticket items be to move the algorithm from bias to equity?
Oh gosh, the first one is easy, getting more diversity and inclusion in people who work in the tech sector, particularly in programming. So more women, more people from marginalised communities, because then even if everyone puts their unconscious bias into the algorithms, there's a diversity of those
Yeah.
biases.
So designer diversity we have
Exactly.
to have. And then what would the second thing be, from your perspective?
The second thing would be bias training for the people who are creating the algorithms in a similar way to in the business sector. You know, you have training in trying to step back from your own unconscious biases. Then even if it is a homogenized group, they sort of understand what they're doing and can correct it while they're writing the algorithms.
Is it okay for me to elevate that to bias consciousness rather than bias training?
Yes, I absolutely love bias consciousness. Thank you.
Okay. And then what would the third thing be?
Oh, the third thing is definitely testing, bias testing for algorithms,
Yeah.
particularly in the criminal justice system when it comes to job applications and also around credit scoring for people wanting, say, a home loan.
What's the purpose of that testing? You called it bias testing, but
Hmm.
what is the purpose of the testing? Is it to
Well, for example, under the legislation in New York, which has been active for about 2 years now, if you have a company that's of a certain size, I think it's over 100 employees, and you use AI for job applications in your hiring software, you must have bias testing every year of the algorithm and the data sets to see that you're not discriminating against two groups, women and people over the age of 50.
so the key with testing is continuous testing?
That's right, because through machine learning, to look at the bottom part of it, even if you rid it in 2024, it can come back in 2025. So you've got to keep
Yeah.
an eye on it.
So what about machine learning? What are the three things that we'd need to get in place to make sure that machine learning is not supporting bias inside AI tools and technology?
Well, the first one is that human in the loop system. Now that we're moving into a more autonomous agentic AI era, they're also calling it a human on-the-loop system. Because machine learning, let me give you an example of this actually that's quite interesting. The Amazon hiring tool in 2018, they de-identified all these CVs, but the machine was so smart, it looked at the interests and hobbies section. And if a woman said, oh, I used to be a basketball champion, or I used to play, netball, it would infer that that CV was from a woman and it would move it aside. So that's why you've got to have human on or in the loop systems to check that the machine hasn't discriminated autonomously.
Right. Great. And then the second thing?
Oh, the second thing with machine learning, it's a little bit tricky because the machine just learns by itself, right?
Yes.
So the first thing is human in on the loop. And the second thing is kind of similar to what I said around the algorithms. You do have to have that testing. So maybe another expression for continuous testing, or perhaps oversight. Oh, I guess that's similar to human in the loop system, isn't it?
Can I use an old term, which is quality control?
Oh, thank you. I do use that in my keynotes, actually, a big quality control.
Yeah, I
So,
mean, we've got decades of quality control experience, and we know how important it is, like in process control, not end of process control. Fix it at the point of failure, not at the compounded end point of failure.
yeah.
And then what would the third thing be?
Well, the third thing would definitely be legislation and regulation, because it's all very well and good to have voluntary guidelines, but like we found out during the era of smoking, a lot of voluntary guidelines did not work and they had to end up putting in strong boundaries. So I would say definitely legislation and regulation.
Right. So if we could move the data sets from bias to equity and the algorithm from bias to equity, it would create an intersection of the two that is positive, that is different to today.
Yes.
And so now we've got data sets that have equity, we've got an algorithm that has equity. What is the result of that when two things come together? What does that do to the AI from an integrity perspective?
The result of that is fairer systems that are ultimately good for business and broader society. In fact, the result of that is something I called protopia, because we often think about technology in a binary way, pun intended, with the zeros and ones. It's either going to lead us to dystopia or utopia. But protopia is a movement where we incrementally introduce this constellation of technologies for the benefit of humanity overall. So everyone is brought along on the journey.
Right. And so then if we moved machine learning from bias to equity, and we have equity of algorithm, what does that intersection create?
Oh, gosh, let me think. What's another way of saying system fairness? It would be, I would say, true diversity, because you would have all the voices at the table from the designer diversity. And with machine learning deepening that, you would have true inclusion, I guess, or even belonging. You know how the conversation's moved a bit from diversity and inclusion to belonging.
Let's call it that. Linguistically, we could do better if we were building this for marketing purposes, but there's a second type of fairness that comes in this, which is this belonging fairness or inclusion fairness that we call it. And then, if the data sets have equity and the machine learning has equity, now we're compelled in the models world, if you've got a pattern emerging, you've got to finish the pattern. So what's the third type of fairness that occurs when the data sets have equity and the machine learning has equity?
Oh, I would say that's future fairness, because the data sets that are being created now, whether it's synthetic data, whether you're cleaning it, whether it's curated, whether you're inserting intentional bias, that creates data sets for the future that are the bedrock of the innovations of the future. And therefore, we have future fairness.
Fantastic. So, if we were speaking to a group of people and we're wanting to, and I'm saying to people, let's talk about AI integrity. There's a lot of conversation about AI and does it have bias and everything else. The conversation we should be having is AI integrity. And AI integrity is a triangle. And if you lose one side of the triangle, the whole thing collapses. And there are three components to that triangle: data sets, algorithm, and machine learning. And the question is, how do we move them from the historical hardwired bias that exists in these to the equity within that component? And so how do we shift data sets from bias to equity? It's three things. Yeah, and they really all sit under this general movement towards synthetic data. The first thing is you've got to clean it. You have to take the historical data and clean it. Junk in, junk out, garbage in, garbage out. And most data sets are so big today that cleaning it by itself is an enormous exercise, and so a lot of people skip it.
Yeah.
The second thing is intentional bias. This is actually, it sounds odd, but this is actually looking at the gaps that exist and how bias, the current historical bias, is working against closing those gaps. And so how do we now intentionally lean towards closing the gaps in the data sets? And then the third thing is curated size. We need to bring the size of these data sets down so they're more controllable, and we can manage them, quite frankly, with greater integrity. And so we have to shift to data integrity. In terms of algorithm, that's really about starting with designer diversity. So how diverse are the voices involved in designing these solutions? And if you're missing, 3/4 of the human population, you've got to assume that solution is not fitting everybody's need from an equity point of view. And then it's about bias consciousness. It's not just training around bias and education. It's absolutely shifting from unconscious bias to conscious bias.
Yes.
And not having that with a conversation that people defend, but having that with a conversation that people value. And then the third thing is continuous testing. We have to continually test the algorithm because they get out of whack over time. And if we continually test them and shift to equity, data sets that have integrity and an algorithm that has integrity produces system fairness. The first level of fairness that we should be producing if we can get rid of bias that's historically within the systems. Then to shift machine learning from bias to equity, that starts with humans in and on the loop. We have to have human engagement inside the technology, because the machines by themselves actually start pushing equity and diversity out in order to fit their model. Then this is an old-fashioned thing, but you've got to have quality control. Controlling quality all the way through, not just waiting till you get to the end and find out it's a big mess, like ongoing quality control. And then there absolutely needs to be regulation and legislation around this. And when you do that, you have machine learning that has integrity, because there's oversight, there's humans in and on the loop, and you're controlling the quality of the machine learning. And when you do that and park it alongside algorithm integrity, what you actually get is this belonging fairness, this inclusion fairness between people that are actually using the technology. And you park it alongside data set integrity, you get future fairness. And so really, we can ignore the conversation or we could have the conversation. But what I'd love to do now, I'm pretending to be you, what I'd love to do now for the rest of the keynote is unpack all the components of that model. And, how does that feel to you as you see it coming back like that?
Simon, this is incredible. You are so good at this, at distilling these complex ideas into an incredible visual model. That is superb. Thank you.
Well, that's my gift to you. You can have that and take that and make it yours and spread it far and wide. I feel like I could chat with you all day about the things that you're trying to do. I'd like to cover off a couple of little things. I've got more questions than we have the time for, but so when you're building a movement, you generally because of structural society, whatever, you're generally having to tackle leadership first. But the movement has to have momentum, and that's volume. So it's kind of a two-ended question. When you put yourself in the mix and you go, I'm going to build a movement here. I want to build a movement around MeToo in Australia. I want to build a movement around bias. I want to build a through line for women and girls in society. You have to tackle leadership. You have to tackle the volume. What are the things you've learnt about building a movement that are, more strategic, more deliberate, that you might have been caught off guard with some things and thought, I'm going to do that differently next time. But the idea of building a movement, what have you learned about that?
The first thing I learned is that we live in the age of the individual and we often forget about the power of collective action.
Mm.
I had the great privilege of going to the United Nations a few months ago for the 70th Commission on the Status of Women. And we're at a time of backlash against the rights of women and girls at the moment globally. Like any human rights movement, it comes in fits and starts. There's a burst, and there was a big burst during the MeToo movement, and now we've got a backlash. Turning up in New York and being in a building full of 4,500 predominantly women and girls from around the world, all coming at this idea from different perspectives, but bringing the movement forward together was one of the most extraordinary feelings of collective action that I've ever had. So that's the first thing. If you want to start a movement, join with other groups, because certainly there are other people who are like-minded. The other thing I would say is around that timing piece. There are better times in history to start movements about certain things compared with other times. So that's that listening piece again, really work on your spidey senses. Have a sense of what way society is moving, whether this is a good time, whether it's not a good time. But even if it's not a good time, it's important to still continue to keep moving forward. Otherwise, we end up being pushed backwards. And the third thing I would say is something I learnt working in the mainstream media, but also kind of against some of the worst practices of the mainstream media, which is when you start standing up for yourself, it's like building a muscle at the gym. The more you do it, the stronger you become. And then it almost becomes a habit.
Right.
I mean, anyone can start a movement, spark a movement, join with other people and move things forward. Anyone has the capacity to do it. It just takes practice.
Well, there's that analogy that if you lay like a builder's plank on the floor in a room and said, I'll give everyone, $10 who can walk across the plank, everyone will take the $10 and walk across the plank. And if you put it a meter in the air, some people wouldn't want to do it. If you put it 2 meters in the air, there'd be more that wouldn't want to do it. If you put it 3 meters in the air, the former gymnasts will go, yeah, I'll walk across that plank for $10, because their calibration they haven't gone from 0 to 3 meters in one step. They've calibrated and built the muscle over time. And I think people are interested these days in creating a movement. So sort of applying those 3 principles, if you like, and look, it's probably the same in terms of running a business, to be honest. Anything where you're trying to get the collective to move, it's really similar. You've been doing it for 30 years, in this career, and MeToo had massive global attention, but movements change and other movements come along. And if you could distill those 30 years, and I don't know how I would answer this for me, so I'll give you a pass if you want to pass on the question, but if you could distill your 30 years into one piece of wisdom you'd want to share with someone who's listening to this, what might that one piece of wisdom be? And I'm thinking about what I would say, and I've got about 5, but I asked you for 1. So let's see if we can do something together with that.
There is one thing I feel very strongly about that I haven't mentioned yet, and it's relevant to all the advocacy that I've done and the work that I've done. For example, around the Me Too movement, I, as a journalist, asked for people to come forward with stories of sexual harassment in the workplace. I expected maybe a handful of people would come forward. More than 2,000 people did. And eventually it was overwhelming. Their stories were heartbreaking. They were going through trauma. It was terrible. And I experienced vicarious trauma very badly. I had to step back from the work for 2 years for the sake of my mental and physical health. So what I would say to people actually over a long career is, yes, build up that muscle, stand up for yourself, create a movement, create momentum, get that collective action happening. But if it gets too much, please step back. You can only be strong for others if you are first strong for yourself. And rest assured that during those times when you do step back, there will be others from that collective movement who will step forward and continue the movement going in the right direction. Because I think a lot of people, particularly, we're in a bit of an era of advocacy, and I think it can come at a huge personal cost. So what I would say is your health and family must come first.
Yeah, well, all performance requires recovery time.
Yes.
All
Great.
training requires recovery time. It's a key part of training, right?
Mm.
Anyone that's been in an athletic pursuit knows that. You can overtrain, right? And so you can overperform. And so, maybe the best thing you could do for the movement is allow yourself some recovery time. And maybe the ultra best thing you could do is build that in so you don't have to step back completely. You've got those recovery periods built in. And I don't think that's necessarily something people think about when they're passionate about something they're trying to do. We've got to run this and get it done as fast as they can. So the world has changed. The work created the change. We have AI integrity in the world. Bias of the past is being replaced at a rate with equity, and business leaders are really aware, and they're effective, not performative. And the political world is effective, not performative, and the media is effective, not performative. What would we be talking about? What would we be seeing? What would we have witnessed around us that we're just going to toast the occurrence of that? And it's 14 years, right? That's actually a long time in today's world.
We would be raising a glass to our children and to their children, knowing that they are living in and facing a future of integrity, of fairness, and of equity, where everyone has opportunities and no one is sidelined or marginalised. I mean, yes, it sounds like a pipe dream, but it would be wonderful to work towards that and to toast that one day for the sake of the generations to come.
We'd be toasting the fact that we truly had been stewards.
I
And we'd
love
taken
that.
what we'd taken the gift we'd been given, and we'd given it back with increase to the next generations.
Yeah.
That would be a great toast. So I'd love to wrap up with 3 quick questions just for people to find out a bit more about you, if that's okay. Rapid fire questions. Is that all right?
Yeah, sure. Good.
Great. The first one, I think is probably going to be pretty easy. What's a recent book that you've read and really actually loved it because of what you got out of it?
Oh boy. Empire of AI by Karen Howe, one of the best pieces of investigative journalism that's been done anywhere in the world on artificial intelligence.
Is that right?
It's phenomenal.
Right. Empire
Of
of
AI.
AI. Okay. Do you have a personal philosophy? I mean, your mother shared some with you and you've already shared some with us, but do you have a personal philosophy that you've developed over time that guides your decision making that you would share, with teenagers and under, and really want to have it, driven into their psyche?
Yes, I learned this the hard way. I used to be very reactive, but now my personal philosophy is take a breath. Before you say something or do something or decide something, just take those few minutes to take a breath and think, what am I going to say, do, or decide? Just take a moment to consider it. And I think that is something that does come with age. But if that could be gifted to younger generations, it would have really helped me when I was younger because I was very quick off the mark. I think
Yeah.
there's nothing wrong with taking a moment to pause.
Well, I talk a lot about pause, and pause in sport is actually a weapon. The pause and the head fake has the other player run past you and gives you open space for the shot, right? But the world has, and in no small measure because of technology, we used to have pause, right? When we didn't have mobile phones, you couldn't check them as soon as you got out of bed, right? So we had a whole lot of things that created pause, but technology has eliminated pause in day-to-day life. You receive an email that's inflammatory, you hit caps lock and start shouting back at them. Turn off automatic send and receive, right? Reread them all before you click the manual send button. You might stop a few, arguments and things like that. But the technology-driven world has eliminated pause, and that idea of take a breath, step back, just take a beat. If we could just gift everybody that, I think the world would be a different place.
I love that you talk about that. That is life-changing.
It's such a simple thing,
Mm.
but we just overlook it all the time. We're in such a fast pace. And then lastly, you've shared so much, and I'm very grateful for the time you've given us. What's something about Tracey Spicer that people and let's think about the Australian audience who feel like they know you so well because we've watched you on TV for so long, and everyone probably feels like you're their best friend. You're in one of those roles that comes into everyone's houses every night and things like that. But what is something about you that people might not know that you're happy to share?
It's a great privilege to have had a job where for decades you come into people's lounge rooms every night. It really is an incredible gift. I'm so grateful for that. What I'm about to share, I would certainly not be doing on television, but I do it at home. I've been a yoga devotee for about 30 years. And even the other day, at the age of 59, I can still do a headstand, which is hilarious. But that is the gift of yoga. If you get yoga into your body, it's a wonderful thing for aging. Yes, I won't be putting that on social media, but I do enjoy doing headstands.
I don't want to one-up you, but my mother is 90 and she still does headstands.
Oh, I'm so impressed by that because I've been thinking, how much longer can I do this for? Is this not going to be good for my body longer term? Thank you. That is inspo for life.
I just wanted to set you the goal. And as she got older, Dad, who's no longer with us, Dad made a frame that she could also rest her shoulders on. And she just puts her head down into the frame and pops her feet up, and she'll stay there for as long as she likes. So I just wanted to, I wasn't trying to one up you. I just wanted to set the goal for you, Tracey, thank you so much for the time you've spent with us. It's just been a joy. It's been so nice getting to speak with you and get to know some of the things that you're doing. And my challenge to everybody listening to this, don't listen to this and go, that was interesting, but dismiss it. The challenge is to listen to this and, everyone's talking about where's the place for humans in an AI-driven world, and maybe the place for humans in an AI-driven world is inequity. And how do we make sure that that's something that is a hardwired component of the system rather than historical biases that work against it? So, Tracey, thank you so much.
I've loved every minute. Thank you so much, Simon.
Thank you.